football field, hovering over the area. It began to rise, and the North American Air Defense Command radar picked it up when it reached an altitude of 1,000 feet. 2 F-106 jet fighters were dispatched from Great Falls, Montana to intercept the craft. But before the fighters arrived, it disappeared from the radar screens. The next day, there were more sightings, both visual and radar, over the base. Each time the jets streamed into the area, the UFOs shut off their lights and reappeared only after the jets left. In the next 8 months, 130 similar reports were logged at the base and in the surrounding county. An early and prominent champion of UFOs was one Donald E. Kehoe, a U.S. Naval Academy graduate and retired Marine Corps major. In the January 1950 issue of True magazine, he wrote a comprehensive article on UFOs. It caused an instant sensation and became one of the most widely read and discussed articles of the day. He claimed that none of his high-level sources would talk about UFOs, which he took as powerful evidence that something tremendously important was being covered up.
This is not an attack on the Air Force spokesman or the project spokesman. They are simply following orders to explain away all UFO sightings as quickly as possible when they become public and deny that UFOs really exist.
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The explanations of those where there is a clear explanation have been made public.
He later became director of the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, where he questioned many governmental agencies about their possible involvement or knowledge of UFOs. The following is an excerpt of a letter from the FBI in answer to one of Major Kehoe's inquiries. In response to your letter of September 22, 1958, this Bureau does not have information on unidentified flying objects which can be released. This does not imply that this Bureau has information concerning unidentified flying objects which cannot be released. Possible communications with extraterrestrial vehicles from another planet, should the unidentified flying object prove to be an extraterrestrial, is not a function of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Signed, John Edgar Hoover, Director of the FBI. There are 6 distinct categories of sightings. Close encounters of the first kind refers to a mere sighting of an unidentified flying object. Close encounters of the second kind includes both the sighting of a UFO as well as tangible proof of the craft having been there, such as marks on the ground, the scorching of grass, or the interference of electrical circuits. Close encounters of the third kind is the direct confrontation with a space being or entity sometimes called a humanoid. Close encounters of the fourth kind involved alleged abductions by UFOs, where people claim to be involuntarily taken on board a UFO, usually for experimental purposes. Close encounters of the fifth kind involve contactees, or those persons who claim to be in personal contact with UFO entities, usually through metaphysical or occult means. Close encounters of the sixth kind include injuries or deaths resulting from a UFO close encounter. One of the greatest waves of UFO sightings in modern history came in 1965, with more than 500 cases reported during the summer months alone. One such case was near Ann Arbor, Michigan, where 50 people and 12 police officers in 3 counties reported having seen objects flashing across the pre-dawn skies. That evening, 87 female students at Hillsdale College near Ann Arbor watched an object flying around and flashing bright lights for a period of about 4 hours. Life magazine said, "Call them what you will, flying saucers, unidentified flying objects, or optical illusions, they are back again and seen by more people than ever before." Last week, the manifestation seemed almost to have reached the proportions of an invasion. In Washington, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford called for a full-blown investigation. Thus, the first congressional hearings on UFOs began as a closed-door session on April 5, 1966. Their conclusion was that a major university be given the job of researching the UFO phenomena. The job was given to the University of Colorado, and Edward Condon, professor of physics, would serve as chairman of the group. After much research, a 1,465-page report was completed by 36 authors at a cost of more than $500,000. The report was summed up under the section titled Conclusions and Recommendations. It states, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectations that science will be advanced thereby." On April 17, 1966, Sheriff's Deputies Dale Spower and Wilbur Neff had just investigated an accident when they noticed a glowing object about 1,000 feet above the ground in eastern Ohio. They then began pursuit at speeds of nearly 90 miles an hour. The third officer, Wayne Houston, was listening to their radio and joined the chase. 85 miles later, they pulled into a service station for refueling, where they met patrolman Frank Panzanella, who had also been tracking the UFO. The officers all stood together, watching the object hover to the east. At that point, the object shot upward at great speed and disappeared. Project Blue Book was called in to investigate. The official Air Force version was that at least 5 experienced police officers, one of them a veteran air crewman, had conducted an hours-long high-speed chase of the planet Venus. For more than 20 years, from 1948 through 1969, the United States Air Force was in charge of investigating UFO reports. The first study, established in 1948, was called Project Sign. Its conclusions were that UFOs were real and estimated them to be interplanetary craft. The Pentagon rebuked the report, calling it science fiction fantasy. The next report, called Project Grudge, was established in early 1949 and would proceed in secrecy. The critics of this investigation complained that the Air Force wanted to control all research on UFOs and that its mandate seemed to deny or explain away all sightings. Project Grudge did not last long and was officially dissolved in December of 1949. However, there had been many recent UFO sightings in New Mexico, so the Air Force launched a new study known as Project Twinkle. An observation post was set up in New Mexico and was armed with cameras, telescopes, and other optical equipment. They waited, and after a year of frustration, the Air Force terminated Project Twinkle. It was not long after this that the government began a new policy of cooperation with the press by issuing regular releases about sightings and investigations. This was followed by a boom year of over 1,500 reports in 1952. The Air Force then established a task force codenamed Project Blue Book, which was to become the most systematic of all studies done by the Air Force. Witnesses received an 8-page questionnaire, photographs were analyzed, and field interviews were conducted. Investigators monitored aircraft flights and checked weather records. On the whole, the Project Blue Book team successfully weeded out UFO reports that were obvious hoaxes or those that could be attributed to natural phenomena. However, for those cases that remained unsolved, investigators had 2 choices: admit that they had failed to identify the object or embrace any remotely feasible explanation. Project Blue Book was terminated in 1969. It concluded that little, if anything, has come from the study of UFOs, and that the least likely explanation of UFOs is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitations by intelligent beings. On the evening of October 25, 1973, a young Pennsylvania farmer, Stephen Pulaski, and at least 15 other witnesses saw a bright object hovering over a field near them. Stephen grabbed his rifle and went to investigate. It was then that he noticed something walking along by the fence. They were hairy and long-armed, with greenish-yellow eyes, and a smell like burning rubber was present. Stephen sensed that these creatures were not friendly and fired a tracer bullet over their heads. And when they kept on coming, he fired directly at one of them. The creatures then all disappeared into the woods, and the glowing object disappeared from the field instantaneously. UFO researchers as well as a state trooper were called in to investigate. When they arrived, the people there told them that Stephen had been growling like an animal and flailing his arms. His own dog ran toward him, and Stephen attacked the dog. Stephen then collapsed, and after a time began to come to his senses. The entire group commented on the nauseating, sulfur-like odor that was present. One of the earliest references to a spacecraft is probably that found in an ancient Egyptian account, some 1,500 years before Christ. One of the characteristics of that craft was the foul odor that emitted from it. The Amityville Horror was based on a factual account of what happened to a family in Amityville, New York. An irritating and nauseating odor seemed to accompany the presence of the ghost or spirit entity that entered there from time to time. Whitley Strieber wrote of his abduction experiences in his book, Communion. He said he could smell their presence and that it smelled like sulfur. On October 11th, 1973, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing when a strange craft descended and hovered near them. Parker passed out, and Hickson was paralyzed, but was able to continue observing what was happening. Two entities then emerged from the craft and picked Hickson up by his arms and carried him inside the ship, where he was thoroughly examined. He was then taken back to where they had been fishing on the riverbank. When the two fishermen went to the sheriff's office to report their story, they were interrogated and then left alone in a room with a hidden microphone. The recording of their conversation revealed that both men were quite frightened by their experience. The emotional trauma had been so great to Parker that after Hickson left the room, he began to pray. Ultimately, he suffered a nervous breakdown as a result of his experience. In the spring of 1959, UFOs brought panic to Soviet radar and Air Force personnel by hovering and circling for more than 24 hours above Sverdlovsk, headquarters of a tactical missile command. Red fighter pilots were ordered airborne to chase the UFOs away, but later reported that the alien objects easily outmaneuvered their jets and zigzagged to avoid their machine gun fire. The Russian spacecraft Salyut-6 returned to Earth in 1978 after 96 days in orbit. They told of a formation of UFOs which trailed them closely for 3 complete orbits around the globe. One of their cameras captured 20 minutes of incredible motion picture footage of this encounter. According to a previous mutual agreement, the Russians forwarded copies of the film to the United States to be analyzed. Unofficial statements from NASA state that it is the best motion picture footage ever filmed of UFOs. The foremost Russian authority on UFOs, Dr. Felix Zeigel, contends that UFOs may have frightened, harassed, and possibly even killed Russian cosmonauts on their missions.
T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
On at least 6 space missions, United States astronauts have encountered UFOs. Journalist Frank Edwards records the following incident.
As Major Cooper was making his final orbit